Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
The moment my parents handed my 15-year-old brother Jake a brand new Apple Watch while sliding a college pamphlet across the table to me, I knew my childhood was officially over. The birthday cake sat between us with "Happy Birthday, Jake" written in blue frosting, even though it was my 18th birthday. My parents didn't even notice the mistake. I forced a smile and laughed along with their jokes about my practical gift, while my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Jake needed me. Jake was struggling. Jake's needs, as always, were what mattered most. "So you want me to come back to take care of Jake's emotional needs?" I said slowly. "Not because you value me as a son, but because Jake functions better when I'm around to support him." My parents exchanged another look, and I could see the truth in their faces. They hadn't come looking for me because they loved me. They'd come looking for me because my absence was making their golden child less perfect. "That's not what we meant," my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's exactly what you meant," I replied, "and it's exactly why I'm not coming home." Pierce pulled out his phone. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, perhaps we should contact local authorities. Patrick is clearly being influenced by people who don't have his best interests at heart." "I'm 18, I said firmly. "I can live wherever I want and work wherever I want. And what I want is to stay here with people who actually see my value instead of just my usefulness." My mother's composure finally cracked completely. "Fine, stay here with these people. See how much they care about you when you're struggling. You'll come crawling back when you realize how hard the real world is." "I've been living in the real world for 6 weeks, I told her. "It's been hard, but it's also been honest. Nobody here lies to me about loving me while stealing from me. Nobody here tells me I'm part of the family while treating me like hired help." She turned toward the door, then spun back around for one final shot. "When you fail here, don't expect us to rescue you. You're choosing these strangers over your own family. That's something you'll have to live with." "I'm choosing people who treat me with respect over people who treat me like a disappointment," I said. "That's something I can live with just fine." As my parents and their private investigator walked toward the door, my father turned back one last time. For just a moment, I thought I saw something like regret in his eyes. "Your room's still there?" he said quietly. "If you change your mind." Then they were gone, and I was left standing in Tony's kitchen with shaking hands and a heart that was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Tony walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. "You okay, kid?" I looked around the restaurant. The other customers were starting to return to their conversations, but several of them gave me supportive nods or thumbs up. These were people who'd watched me work for weeks, who'd seen me study during breaks, who'd gotten to know me as Patrick the prep cook, rather than Patrick the disappointing son. "Yeah," I said, surprised to find that I meant it. "I think I'm okay." But even as I said it, I knew this confrontation was just the beginning. My parents hadn't given up when I disappeared. They weren't going to give up now just because I'd refused to come home voluntarily. They'd found me once, and they'd try again. The difference was that now I wasn't alone. I had Tony, who'd stood up to them without being asked. I had my classmates at the community center who were rooting for my success. I had customers who respected my work ethic and neighbors who'd watched me build a life from nothing. My parents had made it clear that they wanted me back, not because they loved me, but because Jake needed me. That knowledge hurt, but it also freed me from any remaining guilt about my choice to leave. I wasn't running away from home anymore. I was running toward a life where I mattered for who I was, rather than what I could do for someone else. The confrontation at Tony's kitchen turned out to be just the opening salvo in what would become a much larger battle. 2 days later, I received a certified letter at the restaurant that made my blood run cold. My parents were threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent and petition the court to force me into their custody for psychiatric evaluation and treatment. The legal document was full of terms I didn't understand, but the intent was clear. They were claiming I was suffering from some kind of mental breakdown that prevented me from making rational decisions about my life. They'd lined up a psychologist who specialized in troubled teens and apparently believed that running away from home was evidence of psychological instability. I sat in my small apartment above the restaurant, staring at the papers and feeling the walls of my new life closing in. Everything I'd built over the past 7 weeks suddenly felt fragile and temporary. Could they really force me into psychiatric treatment? Could they drag me back home against my will? Tony knocked on my door that evening, bringing dinner from the restaurant and a grim expression. "We need to talk," he said, settling into one of my mismatched chairs. "I made some calls today. You need a lawyer, and you need one fast." "I can't afford a lawyer," I said, thinking about my small savings account. "I've got maybe $1,500 total." "There's a legal aid clinic downtown. They handle cases for people who can't afford private attorneys. I called them this afternoon and explained your situation. They want to see you tomorrow morning." The legal aid clinic was located in a building that had clearly seen better decades, but the attorney who met with me was sharp and professional. Beth Armstrong was a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and the kind of direct manner that made me feel like she'd heard every sob story in the book and wasn't easily fooled. "Tell me everything," she said, pulling out a legal pad. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." I spent 2 hours going through the entire story, from years of favoritism to the stolen college fund to my parents' attempt to have me declared mentally incompetent. Beth took notes steadily, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just listening. "Jake needs our guidance and support." The words felt like ice water in my veins. I wasn't their son in that moment. I was just an obstacle to Jake's success, a burden they tolerated until they could finally be rid of me. I turned the door handle as quietly as possible and stepped out into the cool October night. The street was empty, lit only by scattered streetlights. I started walking toward the bus station downtown, my backpack bouncing gently against my spine with each step. I didn't look back at the house where I'd spent 18 years trying to earn love that was never going to come. The Greyhound bus to Cleveland cost $52, leaving me with $8 in my pocket and a growing pit of anxiety in my stomach. I'd chosen Cleveland because it was far enough from home that my parents wouldn't think to look there, but close enough that I wouldn't spend all my money on the ticket. The bus station in Cleveland at 2 in the morning was a different world. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the faces of people who looked like they'd been forgotten by society. Some slept sprawled across plastic chairs, others paced nervously while talking to themselves. The air smelled like disinfectant mixed with something I couldn't identify but didn't want to think about too hard. I found an empty chair in a corner and tried to look like I belonged there. My backpack felt pitifully small compared to the garbage bags and shopping carts full of belongings that other people had with them. I was beginning to understand that I was now part of a community I'd never paid attention to before. Around 4 in the morning, a security guard approached me. He was a tall black man with kind eyes and graying hair at his temples. His name tag read, Marcus. "Son, you can't sleep here," he said, but his voice was gentle. "Station rules." "I'm not sleeping," I said, trying to sound confident. "Just waiting for the morning buses." Marcus studied my face for a moment, then sat down in the chair next to me. "How old are you?" 18. "You got somewhere to go when the sun comes up?" I shrugged, not trusting my voice to stay steady if I tried to answer. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a thermos. He unscrewed the cap, which doubled as a cup, and poured steaming coffee into it. "Here. You look like you need this more than I do." The coffee was black and strong, but it warmed my hands and gave me something to focus on, besides the fear that was threatening to overwhelm me. Marcus didn't ask any more questions, just sat with me in comfortable silence until the first morning buses started arriving. Listen, he said, as he prepared to continue his rounds. There's a diner about 6 blocks from here called Tony's Kitchen. Owner's name is Tony DeLuca. Tell him Marcus sent you and you're looking for work. He might have something for you. I spent my last $8 on a gas station breakfast burrito and walked the 6 blocks to Tony's Kitchen. It was a small place wedged between a laundromat and a check-cashing store with red vinyl booths and a counter that looked like it had been there since the 1970s. The smell of bacon and coffee hit me as I walked in, making my stomach growl despite the burrito. Behind the counter was a stocky man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and forearms covered in tattoos. He looked up from the grill when I entered, his dark eyes suspicious. "We're not hiring," he said before I could speak. "Marcus from the bus station sent me," I said quickly. "He said you might have work." Tony's expression softened slightly at the mention of Marcus's name. "You ever wash dishes before?" "Yes, sir. I worked at Murphy's Diner back home." "Where's home?" "Used to be Ohio. Now it's wherever I can find work." Tony studied me for a long moment, then nodded toward the back of the restaurant. "Dishwasher quit yesterday. Pays minimum wage plus meals, cash daily, you start now." The work was hard and hot, standing over industrial sinks for 10 hours, with only short breaks. My hands were raw by the end of the first day, and my back ached from leaning over the deep basins. But Tony was true to his word about the meals, and I ate better that day than I had in months. When my shift ended, I realized I had nowhere to go. I'd spent the day so focused on having work that I hadn't thought about where I'd sleep. Tony must have seen the panic in my eyes as I lingered after closing. "There's a homeless shelter 8 blocks north of here," he said, not looking at me as he counted the day's receipts. "Salvation Army. They'll give you a bed if you're there before 7. I made it to the shelter with 15 minutes to spare. The building was old and institutional, with long hallways that echoed with the sounds of dozens of people trying to find dignity in a system designed to strip it away. But it was clean and warm, and the volunteers who checked me in treated me like a human being, rather than a problem to be solved. My roommate was an elderly man named Frank, who'd served 3 tours in Vietnam before losing his leg to an IED. He'd been homeless for 2 years after medical bills bankrupted him, and his wife left. Despite everything he'd been through, Frank had a gentle humor that made the cramped space feel less desperate. "First night?" he asked as I settled onto the thin mattress. "Yes, sir." "Gets easier. Not easy, but easier. You got work?" "Washing dishes at Tony's Kitchen?" Frank smiled. "Tony's good people. Known him since he opened that place 12 years ago. He'll take care of you if you work hard and don't cause trouble." Down the hall, I could hear a baby crying. Frank saw me listening and explained that Sarah, a 19-year-old mother, had been staying at the shelter for 3 weeks with her infant daughter Emma. The father had disappeared when he found out she was pregnant, and her own family had kicked her out for getting pregnant in the first place. "System's broken," Frank said quietly, "but sometimes you find good people in the worst places. Sarah's studying for her GED during the day while Emma naps. Smartest kid I've ever met." As I lay on the narrow bed that first night, listening to the sounds of people who'd fallen through society's cracks, I wondered if my parents had even noticed I was gone yet. It was almost midnight in Ohio, which meant I'd been gone for 22 hours. My phone had been buzzing occasionally throughout the day, but I'd ignored it. Now in the darkness, I finally looked at the screen. 14 missed calls from my father, 6 voicemails, dozens of text messages. I didn't listen to the voicemails or read the texts. Instead, I turned the phone off and put it in my backpack. Whatever my parents had to say, I wasn't ready to hear it. The next morning, I was back at Tony's Kitchen before the sun was up. Tony taught me how to operate the industrial dishwasher and showed me where everything was supposed to go when it was clean. The work was repetitive but oddly soothing, and I found myself falling into a rhythm. During my lunch break, I walked to the public library and used their computers to check the news back home. There was a small article in the local paper about a missing teenager, but it was buried on page 6 and only 3 sentences long. My school photo looked strange in black and white, younger than I felt now. The article quoted my mother saying they were worried sick and hoped I would come to my senses and come home. There was no mention of the watch or the cake or the college fund. No acknowledgement of why I might have left. I clicked over to my parents' Facebook pages. My father had posted a plea for information about my whereabouts, asking friends and family to share it. The comments were full of sympathy and concern, but also speculation about what kind of trouble I must have gotten into to run away from such a loving family. My mother's post was more revealing. She'd written about how difficult I'd been lately and how they'd been trying to help me mature by giving me more responsibility. She mentioned my jealousy of Jake's accomplishments and suggested that I'd left because I couldn't handle his success. Reading those words felt like being punched in the stomach. Even in my absence, even when they were supposedly worried about my safety, they were painting me as the problem. Jake was the golden child who deserved their investment and attention. I was the troublemaker who'd run away because I couldn't appreciate what a wonderful family I had. I closed the browser and walked back to Tony's kitchen for my afternoon shift. I scrubbed dishes until my hands were numb, grateful for the simple clarity of soap and hot water and the satisfaction of making something dirty clean again. That night at the shelter, I met Sarah properly. She was younger than I'd expected, with tired eyes but a determined set to her jaw. Emma was a beautiful baby with dark hair and the biggest brown eyes I'd ever seen. Sarah was feeding her a bottle in the common area when I introduced myself. "Frank told me you're working at Tony's," she said. "That's great. He's one of the few restaurant owners around here who doesn't treat homeless people like criminals." "How long have you been here?" I asked. 3 weeks. Emma and I age out of the youth program next month, so I'm trying to save enough for a deposit on an apartment. It's hard when you're paying for daycare and formula and trying to study. I thought about my $60 an hour wage at Tony's and how much that would mean to someone trying to support a baby. "What are you studying?" "Getting my GED first, then hopefully nursing school. I want Emma to grow up seeing her mom work toward something better." That night, I lay awake thinking about the difference between Sarah's courage and my parents' cowardice. Sarah was 18 just like me, but she was fighting every day to build a future for herself and her daughter. My parents were adults with jobs and a house and all the advantages in the world. But they'd chosen to tear down one son to build up another. By the end of my first week in Cleveland, I'd established a routine. Work at Tony's from 6 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, dinner at the shelter, evening at the library studying for my GED online. Back to the shelter by 9 for lights out. Tony had started trusting me with more responsibilities, letting me help with food prep during slow periods. I discovered I actually enjoyed cooking, something I'd never had the chance to explore at home. My mother had always treated the kitchen like her private domain, and Jake had never shown any interest in learning. On Friday night, as I was finishing my shift, Tony handed me my pay in cash as usual. But this time there was an extra $20. "Bonus for your first week," he said gruffly. "You're a good worker, better than the last 3 kids I hired." I stared at the money in my hand. It was the first time in my life that someone had recognized my work with more than just words. Tony hadn't given me the bonus because he was my parent and felt obligated. He'd given it to me because I'd earned it. "Thank you, Mr. DeLuca." "Just Tony and Patrick?" "Yes, sir." "Whatever happened that made you end up here, don't let it make you bitter. Bitter people don't last long in this business or in this world." That night, I turned my phone back on for the first time in a week. The voicemails and texts had stopped after day 3, but there was one new message from a number I didn't recognize. It was from a local news station back home. "Hi, Patrick. This is Jennifer Mills from Channel 7 News. We're doing a story about missing teenagers and would love to speak with you about your situation. Your parents are very concerned and would like to share their side of the story. Please call me back." Their side of the story. As if my leaving was just a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with better public relations. I deleted the message without listening to the rest and turned the phone off again. Whatever story my parents were telling back home, I was writing a new one here in Cleveland. It was harder and scarier than anything I'd ever done, but for the first time in my life, it was mine. 3 weeks into my new life in Cleveland, I was starting to believe I might actually make it. Tony had offered me a small apartment above the restaurant for $200 a month, which was less than half what I'd been making working full-time. The space wasn't much larger than my bedroom back home, but it had a tiny kitchen, a bathroom with a shower that actually had decent water pressure. And most importantly, it was mine. The apartment came furnished with a single bed, a small table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a dresser that had seen better decades. But I'd never been happier to have so little. Every morning I woke up knowing that no one was going to compare me to someone else or tell me I wasn't trying hard enough or wasn't worth their investment. Tony had also promoted me from dishwasher to prep cook, which meant learning to use the big industrial knives and preparing vegetables, sauces, and marinades for the daily menu. My hands were developing calluses from the knife work, but I found the precision and rhythm of chopping oddly meditative. "You got good knife skills," Tony told me one morning as I finished preparing vegetables for the lunch rush. "You ever think about culinary school?" The question caught me off guard. No one in my family had ever asked me what I wanted to study or what career interested me. All conversations about the future had centered around Jake's potential and how to maximize it. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I never really thought about it. There's a community college program not far from here. Part-time classes, mostly evenings. Good reputation. You should look into it." That afternoon during my break, I walked to the Cleveland Community College campus. It was bigger than I'd expected, with modern buildings and students who looked like they came from all different backgrounds and age groups. The culinary arts program occupied an entire building with professional-grade kitchens that made Tony's setup look like a home kitchen. I picked up a brochure and application from the admissions office. The program was 2 years long and cost about $8,000 total, which seemed impossibly expensive until I realized I could take classes part-time and continue working at Tony's. Financial aid was available, and they had a work-study program that placed students in local restaurants for credit and pay. Walking back to Tony's, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Excitement about my future. For 18 years, I'd been told that my role was to support Jake's dreams and not ask for too much for myself. Now suddenly I was surrounded by people who seemed to think my dreams mattered too. That evening, I went to the community center where GED classes were held 3 nights a week. My teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was a woman in her 50s who'd been teaching adult education for 20 years. She had a warm smile and an endless patience for students who were returning to education after difficult starts in life. "Patrick Wright," she said, as I settled into a desk near the back of the classroom. "How's the studying going?" "Good, I think. I'm ready for the practice test whenever you think I should take it." "Let's do that next week. I think you'll surprise yourself with how well you do." The other students in the class were a mix of ages and backgrounds, but we'd all ended up in the same place for different reasons. There was Carlos, a 23-year-old former gang member who was trying to turn his life around after getting out of prison. Jessica was a 17-year-old mother working 2 jobs while trying to finish her education. David was a 45-year-old construction worker who dropped out in 10th grade and was finally getting his diploma so he could qualify for supervisor positions. During break, Carlos and I often talked about work and future plans. He was hoping to get into an electrician apprenticeship program, something that would give him steady work and keep him away from his old neighborhood and old friends. "You got it easier than most of us," he told me one night as we walked to the bus stop together. "You got family to fall back on if things get rough." I didn't correct him. It was easier to let people assume I had a safety net than to explain why I was estranged from my parents. But the truth was, I felt more supported by my GED classmates and my co-workers at Tony's than I ever had by my own family. Jessica was especially inspiring to watch. She came to class 3 nights a week after working a morning shift at a gas station and an afternoon shift cleaning office buildings. Her daughter stayed with her grandmother during class, and Jessica often showed up with textbooks covered in coffee stains and notes written on napkins from whatever restaurant she'd grabbed dinner. "My daughter's going to see her mama graduate," she told me one night when I complimented her dedication. "And she's going to know that education matters even if you have to fight for it." 1 month into my new routine, I finally decided to check my phone messages. I'd been carrying the phone with me, but keeping it turned off, telling myself I needed to focus on getting stable before dealing with my past. There were 47 voicemails from my father. The early ones were angry, demanding that I come home and stop being dramatic. By the second week, his tone had shifted to pleading. The most recent messages were just him crying and begging me to call back. There were only 3 messages from my mother, all within the first few days. She sounded annoyed rather than worried, as if my leaving was an inconvenience, rather than a crisis. In the last message, she told me I was being selfish and hurting Jake by taking attention away from his college preparation. Jake had left 2 messages. In the first, he sounded confused and hurt, asking why I'd left without saying goodbye. In the second, recorded just 3 days ago, he sounded angry. He blamed me for making everything tense at home and said our parents were fighting constantly about whether to keep looking for me or let Patrick learn his lesson the hard way. I deleted all the messages without responding and turned the phone off again. Whatever was happening at home wasn't my responsibility anymore. I'd tried for 18 years to be the son they wanted, and it had never been enough. Now I was going to try being the person I wanted to be and see how that worked out. 2 weeks later, I took my GED practice test and scored high enough in all 5 subjects that Mrs. Rodriguez recommended I register for the real exam. The test was scheduled for the following month, and passing it would officially give me the equivalent of a high school diploma. "I'm proud of you, Patrick," Mrs. Rodriguez told me after reviewing my practice scores. "You're one of the most dedicated students I've worked with. Have you thought about what you want to do next?" I told her about the culinary program at the community college, and her face lit up. "That's perfect. You know I have a friend who teaches in that program, Professor Martinez. I could put in a good word for you if you're interested." For the first time in months, I thought about social media. Back home, Jake's Instagram was probably full of pictures from baseball games and family dinners and college visits. My parents' Facebook pages were likely documenting his achievements and their pride in his success. But I was proud of my achievements too, even if they weren't the kind that got shared on social media. I was proud that I'd found work and housing and was pursuing my education. I was proud that I'd made friends who respected me and mentors who believed in my potential. I was proud that I was learning to cook and discovering talents I never knew I had. That night, I created new social media accounts under the name Patrick Thomas instead of Patrick Morrison. I wasn't ready to be found by my old life, but I wanted to document my new one. I posted a picture of a dish I'd helped prepare at Tony's with a caption about learning to cook and pursuing my GED. The response was immediate and encouraging. My classmates from the community center liked and commented on the post. Tony's regular customers who'd gotten to know me over the past month shared it with supportive messages. Even Mrs. Rodriguez found my account and left a comment about how proud she was of my progress. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was building something that belonged to me. Not something I was expected to be grateful for, not something I was sharing with a sibling who deserved it more, just something that was mine because I'd worked for it and earned it. 3 days later, as I was closing up the restaurant after the dinner shift, Tony approached me with a serious expression. "Patrick, we need to talk." My stomach dropped. Had I done something wrong? Was he firing me? "Your family's been looking for you," he said quietly. "Someone came by today asking questions. Private investigator, I think. Showed me your picture and asked if I'd seen you." The safety and peace I'd been building over the past 6 weeks suddenly felt fragile and temporary. My parents weren't going to let me disappear quietly. They were actively hunting me down, not because they missed me or loved me, but because my absence was probably interfering with their perfect family narrative. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "Told him I'd never seen you before. But Patrick, if they found this place, they're getting close. You need to be prepared for them to show up." That night, I lay awake in my small apartment above the restaurant listening to the sounds of the city below and trying to figure out what I'd do if my parents found me. I was 18, legally an adult, so they couldn't force me to come home. But they could make my new life very complicated if they wanted to. I thought about Carlos and Jessica and David, all of whom had overcome obstacles much bigger than disapproving parents. I thought about Sarah at the shelter, who was building a future for herself and her daughter despite having no family support at all. I thought about Tony, who'd given me a chance when he didn't have to, and Mrs. Rodriguez, who believed in my potential, even though she'd only known me for a few weeks. Whatever my parents wanted from me now, I wasn't going to give up the life I was building. I'd found people who saw my value and invested in my success. I'd found work that challenged me and education that excited me. I'd found a community where I belonged. If my parents wanted me back, they were going to have to explain why they deserved me in their lives. After 18 years of showing me, they didn't value having me there. I should have known my peaceful new existence was too good to last. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after I'd left home, I was in the kitchen at Tony's preparing vegetables for the lunch rush when the front door chimed. I looked up through the service window and felt my blood turn to ice. My father, Robert, stood near the hostess station looking older and more tired than I remembered. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and his hair uncombed. Next to him stood my mother, Linda, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval as she surveyed the modest restaurant with obvious distaste. Behind them was a man in an expensive suit who was clearly not family. He had the alert, calculating look of someone who found people for a living. The private investigator Tony had warned me about. Tony emerged from his office and approached the group. I ducked lower behind the prep counter, my hands shaking as I continued chopping onions with mechanical precision. "Can I help you folks?" Tony asked in his usual gruff but polite manner. "We're looking for our son." My father said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who expected cooperation. "Patrick Morrison, 18 years old. We have reason to believe he's been working here." "Don't know anyone by that name," Tony replied without hesitation. "You got a picture?" The private investigator, who introduced himself as Daniel Pierce, pulled out a photo of me from my high school yearbook. It was the same picture that had been in the newspaper back home. But seeing it in this context made my stomach churn. "He's been missing for 6 weeks," my mother said, her voice sharp with frustration. "We know he's in this area because his phone was tracked to this neighborhood before he turned it off." Phone tracking. I hadn't even thought about that. My parents hadn't just hired a private investigator. They'd been monitoring my location electronically until I'd finally turned the phone off permanently 3 weeks ago. "Like I said, never seen him," Tony repeated. "But if you want to leave your information, I'll keep an eye out." "This is ridiculous," my mother snapped. "We know he's here. Patrick always was dramatic, and this is just another one of his attempts to get attention. He needs to stop this nonsense and come home." My father placed a hand on her arm, trying to calm her down, but she shrugged him off. "We've been patient long enough," she continued. "His brother Jake is applying to colleges, and this family crisis is affecting his concentration. Patrick's always been jealous of Jake's success, and now he's trying to sabotage Jake's future out of spite." Tony's expression hardened. "Lady, I don't know what kind of family problems you got, but this is a restaurant, not a counseling center. I told you I haven't seen your kid. You can either order some food or leave." That's when Daniel Pierce stepped forward, pulling out his wallet. "Mr. DeLuca, isn't it I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 for information about Patrick's whereabouts? All we want is to reunite this family." $5,000. More than I made in 3 months at my current salary. I held my breath, waiting to see if Tony's loyalty to me was worth more than that kind of money. Tony looked at the cash in Pierce's hand for a long moment, then back at my parents. You know what's interesting? Most parents who are worried about missing kids talk about how much they love them and miss them. All you've talked about is how inconvenient this is for you. How dare you judge us? My mother said, her voice rising. We've given Patrick everything. A good home, food, clothing opportunities. He's throwing it all away because he can't handle the fact that his brother is more successful. More successful at what? Tony asked. Kid's 18. What kind of success we talking about here? Jake is being recruited by colleges for baseball, my father said, speaking for the first time since the introduction. He's exceptional. Patrick's always had trouble accepting that some people are just more naturally gifted. I could see Tony's jaw clench. In the weeks I'd been working for him, he'd seen me arrive early, stay late, learn quickly, and work harder than employees twice my age. He'd watched me study during breaks and save every penny I earned. The idea that I was lazy or untalented would be laughable to him. And what's Patrick good at? Tony asked. My parents exchanged a look. The pause that followed was answer enough. Patrick's always been more of a follower, my mother finally said. He needs structure and guidance. That's why we need to bring him home. Sounds like what he needs is a family that notices when he's doing well, instead of just when he's causing problems, Tony replied. Now, like I said, I haven't seen your boy. But if I did see him, I'd probably tell him to stay far away from people who talk about him like he's a burden. Pierce tried a different approach. Mr. DeLuca, we have reason to believe Patrick may be involved with dangerous individuals. He's been staying at homeless shelters associating with criminals and drug addicts. His family is concerned for his safety. That accusation made my anger spike. Frank, the veteran, who'd shared his wisdom and warmth during my first nights at the shelter. Sarah, the teenage mother working 2 jobs to support her baby. Carlos trying to build a legitimate life after his mistakes. These people had shown me more genuine care in 6 weeks than my family had in 18 years. Tony's response was immediate and fierce. Mister, you clearly don't know much about the people you're talking about. I know most of the folks at that shelter, and they're good people, dealing with bad circumstances. A lot more honest than some people in fancy houses who steal from their own kids. The words hung in the air like an accusation. My mother's face went pale. What did you say? My father asked quietly. I said a lot of the homeless folks in this neighborhood are more honest than people who steal from their own children. Funny thing about working in a restaurant in this part of town. You hear stories. You learn about families who take their kids' money and spend it on the golden child. You see what real abuse looks like. My mother stepped forward, her voice dangerous. How dare you accuse us of abuse? We never laid a hand on Patrick. There's more than one way to hurt a kid, Tony replied calmly. Some of the worst damage doesn't leave bruises. That's when my father seemed to notice something. His eyes had been scanning the restaurant while Tony and my mother argued, and now his gaze settled on the prep area where I was crouched behind the counter. Patrick, he called out tentatively. Patrick, is that you? I stood up slowly, my knife still in my hand, vegetables scattered across the cutting board. My parents stared at me as if I were a ghost. I probably looked different than they remembered. 6 weeks of physical labor had filled out my shoulders and arms. My hair was longer, and I'd grown the beginning of a beard. I looked older, more solid, like someone who worked for his living. Hello, Mom, Dad. My mother's first words weren't relief or love or even anger. They were pure exasperation. Patrick, thank God. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused? We've spent thousands of dollars on this private investigator. Your father's missed work. Jake's been a wreck. Jake's been a wreck, I repeated, setting down my knife. How has any of this affected Jake? The stress in the house has been terrible, she said, as if this were obvious. He's had to deal with us being upset and worried. His grades have suffered. College scouts don't want to recruit players from unstable families. I stared at her, trying to process the logic. I'd been gone for 6 weeks, surviving on my own, building a new life from nothing. And her concern was how my absence had affected Jake's baseball prospects. "Pack your things," my father said, trying to sound authoritative. "We're going home. This little experiment is over." No. The word came out stronger than I'd intended. My parents looked shocked, as if the possibility of refusal hadn't occurred to them. "Excuse me," my mother said. I said, "No, I'm not coming home. I have a job here. I have an apartment. I'm getting my GED and applying to culinary school. This isn't an experiment. This is my life now." Pierce stepped forward, clearly earning his fee. "Patrick, your parents love you and want you home. Whatever problems you think you had, they can be worked out as a family." "What problems I think I had?" I laughed, and the sound was bitter, even to my own ears. "You want to know what problems I had? They spent my college fund on Jake's baseball coaching. They took money out of my savings account without telling me. They forgot it was my birthday and put Jake's name on my cake. They canceled my graduation party to pay for Jake's summer camp." "Those are misunderstandings," my father said quickly. "We can explain everything." "Then explain this," I said, pulling my phone out of my pocket. I'd screenshot some of their Facebook posts before deleting the app. "Explain why Mom posted about how difficult and jealous I am. Explain why you told Aunt Carol that you only need to worry about Jake's future because I'll figure something out on my own." My mother's face went red. "You were eavesdropping on private conversations. I was living in the same house and listening to my parents talk about why I don't matter as much as my brother." The restaurant had gone quiet except for our voices. Other customers were pretending not to stare, but I could feel their attention. Tony's regular customers had gotten to know me over the past month and a half. They'd seen me work hard and heard me talk about my goals. Now they were seeing my parents treat me like a runaway child, rather than a young adult who'd made a deliberate choice about his life. "You're 18, Pierce said, changing tactics. "You can't support yourself long-term on a dishwasher's salary? Your parents are offering you a home food help with college. Why would you choose to struggle when you don't have to—" Before I could answer, Tony stepped forward. "For the record, Patrick's not a dishwasher anymore. He's a prep cook, and a good one. He's also one of the hardest working kids I've ever hired. And he's got more integrity in his little finger than some people have in their whole bodies." "This is none of your business," my mother snapped at Tony. "Patrick is our son." "And he's my employee," Tony shot back. "Good employees are hard to find. I'm not letting you drag away one of the best workers I've ever had just because you suddenly remembered you have 2 kids instead of 1. That's when my father said something that changed everything. "Patrick, we need you to come home. Jake's struggling without you there. His anxiety has gotten worse since you left. He needs his big brother." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Not that they missed me or loved me or were worried about my welfare. Jake needed me. Jake was struggling. Jake's needs, as always, were what mattered most. "So you want me to come back to take care of Jake's emotional needs?" I said slowly. "Not because you value me as a son, but because Jake functions better when I'm around to support him." My parents exchanged another look, and I could see the truth in their faces. They hadn't come looking for me because they loved me. They'd come looking for me because my absence was making their golden child less perfect. "That's not what we meant," my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. "That's exactly what you meant," I replied. "And it's exactly why I'm not coming home." Pierce pulled out his phone. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, perhaps we should contact local authorities. Patrick is clearly being influenced by people who don't have his best interests at heart." "I'm 18, I said firmly. "I can live wherever I want and work wherever I want. And what I want is to stay here with people who actually see my value instead of just my usefulness." My mother's composure finally cracked completely. "Fine, stay here with these people. See how much they care about you when you're struggling. You'll come crawling back when you realize how hard the real world is. I've been living in the real world for 6 weeks, I told her. It's been hard, but it's also been honest. Nobody here lies to me about loving me while stealing from me. Nobody here tells me I'm part of the family while treating me like hired help. She turned toward the door, then spun back around for one final shot. When you fail here, don't expect us to rescue you. You're choosing these strangers over your own family. That's something you'll have to live with. I'm choosing people who treat me with respect over people who treat me like a disappointment, I said. That's something I can live with just fine. As my parents and their private investigator walked toward the door, my father turned back one last time. For just a moment, I thought I saw something like regret in his eyes. "Your room's still there?" he said quietly. "If you change your mind." Then they were gone, and I was left standing in Tony's kitchen with shaking hands and a heart that was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Tony walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. "You okay, kid?" I looked around the restaurant. The other customers were starting to return to their conversations, but several of them gave me supportive nods or thumbs up. These were people who'd watched me work for weeks, who'd seen me study during breaks, who'd gotten to know me as Patrick the prep cook, rather than Patrick the disappointing son. "Yeah," I said, surprised to find that I meant it. "I think I'm okay." But even as I said it, I knew this confrontation was just the beginning. My parents hadn't given up when I disappeared. They weren't going to give up now just because I'd refused to come home voluntarily. They'd found me once, and they'd try again. The difference was that now I wasn't alone. I had Tony, who'd stood up to them without being asked. I had my classmates at the community center who were rooting for my success. I had customers who respected my work ethic and neighbors who'd watched me build a life from nothing. My parents had made it clear that they wanted me back, not because they loved me, but because Jake needed me. That knowledge hurt, but it also freed me from any remaining guilt about my choice to leave. I wasn't running away from home anymore. I was running toward a life where I mattered for who I was, rather than what I could do for someone else. The confrontation at Tony's kitchen turned out to be just the opening salvo in what would become a much larger battle. 2 days later, I received a certified letter at the restaurant that made my blood run cold. My parents were threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent and petition the court to force me into their custody for psychiatric evaluation and treatment. The legal document was full of terms I didn't understand, but the intent was clear. They were claiming I was suffering from some kind of mental breakdown that prevented me from making rational decisions about my life. They'd lined up a psychologist who specialized in troubled teens and apparently believed that running away from home was evidence of psychological instability. I sat in my small apartment above the restaurant, staring at the papers and feeling the walls of my new life closing in. Everything I'd built over the past 7 weeks suddenly felt fragile and temporary. Could they really force me into psychiatric treatment? Could they drag me back home against my will? Tony knocked on my door that evening, bringing dinner from the restaurant and a grim expression. "We need to talk," he said, settling into one of my mismatched chairs. "I made some calls today. You need a lawyer, and you need one fast." "I can't afford a lawyer," I said, thinking about my small savings account. "I've got maybe $1,500 total." "There's a legal aid clinic downtown. They handle cases for people who can't afford private attorneys. I called them this afternoon and explained your situation. They want to see you tomorrow morning." The legal aid clinic was located in a building that had clearly seen better decades, but the attorney who met with me was sharp and professional. Beth Armstrong was a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and the kind of direct manner that made me feel like she'd heard every sob story in the book and wasn't easily fooled. "Tell me everything," she said, pulling out a legal pad. "Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." I spent 2 hours going through the entire story, from years of favoritism to the stolen college fund to to my parents' attempt to have me declared mentally incompetent. Beth took notes steadily, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just listening. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me for a moment. Patrick, what your parents did with your money isn't just unethical, it's criminal. If you can prove they took money from your accounts without permission, that's theft. The fact that you're their son doesn't give them the right to steal from you. But I'm only 18. Don't they have some kind of legal authority over me? Not anymore. The moment you turned 18, you became a legal adult with full rights to make your own decisions about where you live, where you work, and how you spend your money. Your parents can't force you into psychiatric treatment unless they can prove to a court that you're an immediate danger to yourself or others. She flipped through her notes, then looked back at me. I'm going to take your case, Patrick, pro bono. This kind of family financial abuse makes me angry, and I think we can not only get your money back, but also put a stop to your parents' harassment. Over the next week, Beth began building our case. She subpoenaed my bank records, which showed a clear pattern of unauthorized withdrawals that coincided with payments to Jake's baseball coaching and equipment expenses. She also requested documentation of the college fund my parents had mentioned, which revealed that money specifically earmarked for both children had been spent entirely on Jake's activities. The investigation revealed something even more disturbing. My grandmother had left me a $10,000 inheritance when she died 3 years ago, money that was supposed to be held in trust until I turned 18. My parents had forged my signature on documents transferring that money to Jake's college fund. This is fraud, Beth told me as we reviewed the documents in her office. Your parents didn't just spend money they'd saved for both of you. They stole money that was legally yours and gave it to your brother. The evidence was overwhelming, but that didn't make the legal process any easier. My parents hired their own attorney, an expensive-looking man who immediately began painting me as a troubled teen who'd been manipulated by unsavory characters into making false accusations against his loving family. The local newspaper picked up the story, running articles about family disputes and missing teen found living on streets. The coverage was frustratingly vague, focusing more on the drama than the facts. My parents gave interviews portraying themselves as heartbroken parents whose son had been brainwashed by people who wanted to exploit him. But something unexpected happened. The story resonated with other people who'd experienced similar family dynamics. Letters started arriving at the legal aid clinic from adults who'd grown up in households where one child was clearly favored over another. Support donations came in to help with legal expenses. Local business owners who'd heard about the case through Tony began offering encouragement and assistance. 3 weeks into the legal proceedings, I was working the dinner shift at Tony's when Jake walked in alone. He looked terrible, thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes. He sat at the counter and waited until I could take a break to talk to him. "Can we go somewhere private?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We went up to my apartment and Jake sat heavily on my small couch. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. "I didn't know," he finally said, "about the college fund, about Grandma's money, about any of it." I studied my younger brother's face, trying to determine if this was genuine or if my parents had sent him to manipulate me into dropping the legal case. "What did you think was happening?" I asked carefully. "Mom and Dad always told me you were jealous of me, that you left because you couldn't handle my success. They said you were making up stories about favoritism to hurt our family." Jake's voice cracked on the last words, and I could see that he was struggling to hold back tears. "But then I heard them talking to their lawyer," he continued, "about the money they took from your accounts, about forging your signature, and I realized that everything you said was true." I felt a mix of vindication and sadness. I'd been right about the financial abuse, but that meant Jake had been unwittingly complicit in it for years. "Jake, you were just a kid. You didn't know they were stealing from me to pay for your activities." "But I should have noticed that you never got anything. I should have wondered why I had all these opportunities and you didn't. I was so focused on making them proud that I never thought about whether they were being fair to you. He looked around my small apartment, taking in the secondhand furniture and modest accommodations. Is this really better than being at home? He asked. I thought about how to answer that question honestly. My apartment was tiny, and my savings account was small. I worked long hours for modest pay and was pursuing my education at night while living paycheck to paycheck. Yes, I said without hesitation. It's better because it's honest. Nobody here lies to me about loving me while stealing from me. Nobody here tells me I'm part of the family while treating me like I don't matter. Jake was quiet for another long moment. The house feels wrong without you there. Mom and Dad fight all the time now. Dad says it's because he's worried about you, but Mom says it's because you're being dramatic and causing problems for no reason. What do you think? I think they don't know how to handle the fact that one of their kids stood up to them. And I think they're scared that people will find out they're not as perfect as they pretend to be. That evening after Jake left, I called Beth to tell her about our conversation. She was interested in the possibility of Jake testifying about what he'd witnessed at home, but she warned me that it could drive an even bigger wedge between me and my family. Your brother seems genuinely remorseful, she said, but your parents are still fighting this case hard. They're claiming that you've been manipulated by outside influences and that your accusations are part of some kind of psychiatric episode. A week later, everything changed again. I was working the morning shift when my phone rang. It was Jake, and he was crying. Patrick, you need to know something. Dad's in the hospital. He had a heart attack last night. My first instinct was panic, followed immediately by guilt. Had the stress of our legal battle caused my father's medical emergency? Is he okay? I asked. He's stable, but the doctors say it was stress-related. Mom's been telling everyone that it's your fault. The dad got sick because you've been putting the family through hell with these false accusations. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Even when my father was lying in a hospital bed, my mother was using his condition to blame me for the family's problems. Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you want me to drop the legal case? There was a long pause. No, he said finally. What they did to you was wrong. Dad having a heart attack doesn't change that. But I'm scared about what's going to happen to our family. We stopped being a family long before I left home, I told him. A family doesn't steal from one child to benefit another. A family doesn't lie and manipulate and blame. What we had was a business arrangement where I was expected to provide support for you in exchange for basic necessities. That night, I visited my father in the hospital. He looked older and frailer than I'd ever seen him connected to monitors and IVs. My mother was in the chair next to his bed, and she looked up when I entered with pure hatred in her eyes. "How dare you show up here?" she hissed. "This is your fault. Your selfishness put your father in this bed." "Linda, stop," my father said weakly from the hospital bed. "We need to talk to Patrick." For the first time in my life, I heard my father tell my mother to be quiet. She looked shocked, but she sat back in her chair and crossed her arms. "Son," my father said, his voice hoarse, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." I pulled a chair over to his bedside, not sure what to expect. "I've been thinking lying here with nothing to do but think about how we treated you, about the choices we made, about the money." He paused to catch his breath. "You were right. About all of it." My mother started to protest, but my father held up a weak hand to silence her. "We did steal from you. We did favor Jake. We did treat you like you didn't matter as much. And when you had the courage to stand up for yourself, we tried to destroy your new life instead of examining our own behavior." I felt tears starting in my eyes, but I wasn't sure if they were from relief, sadness, or anger. "The heart attack wasn't your fault," he continued. "It was mine. The stress of knowing I'd failed as a father. The guilt of realizing I'd raised one son by tearing down the other. The shame of having to face what kind of man I'd become." He looked over at my mother, who was staring at him, as if he'd lost his mind. "Linda, we need to stop fighting Patrick's lawsuit. We need to give him back every penny we took plus interest. And we need to leave him alone to build the life he wants." "Absolutely not," my mother said firmly. "Patrick is being manipulated by people who want to destroy our family. This is all part of some scheme to get money from us." My father closed his eyes, looking exhausted. "Linda, the only people who destroyed our family were us. And if you can't see that, then you're going to lose both of our sons instead of just one." As I left the hospital that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions. My father's apology meant something, but it also raised questions about what came next. Could our relationship be repaired after 18 years of damage? Did I even want it to be? What I knew for certain was that I wasn't going to drop the legal case. My father's heart attack was tragic, but it didn't erase the financial abuse or the years of emotional neglect. If he was genuinely sorry, he'd support my right to seek justice for what had been done to me. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since my parents had shown up at Tony's kitchen, I felt like I might actually win. My father's heart attack marked a turning point in our family's legal and emotional warfare, but not in the way anyone expected. While he was recovering in the hospital, genuinely trying to make amends, my mother, Linda, was escalating her campaign to paint me as mentally unstable and manipulated by predatory adults. She hired a new attorney, someone who specialized in family reunification cases, and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. This lawyer, Margaret Whitman, immediately filed new motions, claiming that I was suffering from Stockholm Syndrome and had been brainwashed by the homeless population and restaurant workers who'd exploited my vulnerability. The legal papers were filled with character assassination attempts against Tony, Mrs. Rodriguez, and even Frank and Sarah from the homeless shelter. They painted my support network as criminals and degenerates who'd taken advantage of a troubled and confused teenager for their own purposes. Beth was furious when she read the new filings. "This is desperation," she told me as we sat in her office reviewing the accusations. "Your mother's attorney is throwing everything at the wall, hoping something will stick. But these tactics usually backfire with judges who can see through obvious manipulation." The case was scheduled for a hearing in 2 weeks, where both sides would present evidence and testimony. I would have to face my parents in court and tell my story under oath while they'd try to convince a judge that I was incompetent to make decisions about my own life. 3 days before the hearing, something unexpected happened that changed everything. I was working the lunch shift at Tony's when a well-dressed woman in her 50s entered the restaurant and asked to speak with me. She introduced herself as Carol Patterson, and it took me a moment to realize she was my father's sister, my Aunt Carol. "I've been following the court case," she said as we sat in a corner booth. "Your mother called me asking for character testimony about what a troubled child you've always been. That's when I knew I needed to come see you myself." Aunt Carol had always been the family member I felt closest to, but we'd grown apart over the years as my parents discouraged contact with relatives who asked too many questions about our family dynamics. "Patrick, I want you to know that I've been worried about you for years. Every time I visited, I could see how differently you were treated compared to Jake. But when I tried to talk to your parents about it, they shut me down and limited my visits." She pulled out a manila envelope and set it on the table between us. "There's something you need to know about your grandmother's will, something your parents never told you." Inside the envelope were copies of legal documents I'd never seen before. My grandmother had left me more than just $10,000. She'd left me a trust fund worth $50,000 money that was supposed to be completely off limits until I turned 21. "Your parents have been managing this trust as your legal guardians," Aunt Carol explained, "but they've been using it to cover household expenses and Jake's activities for the past 3 years. According to these bank statements, there's less than $5,000 left." I stared at the documents, trying to process what I was seeing. My parents hadn't just stolen $10,000 from me. They'd stolen $50,000 money my grandmother had specifically intended to give me independence and opportunities as a young adult. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked. "Because your mother called me yesterday, asking me to testify that you've always been mentally unstable and prone to making false accusations. She wanted me to say that you've been jealous of Jake since childhood and that you're making up stories to hurt your family." Aunt Carol's expression was grim. "Patrick, I've watched your parents gaslight you for years. I've seen them rewrite history to make Jake the hero and you the problem. I won't be part of that anymore. This financial abuse has to stop." Beth was ecstatic when I brought her the trust fund documents. "This changes everything," she said immediately. "Filing new motions with the court. Your parents aren't just guilty of theft anymore. They're guilty of massive financial fraud. They could be facing criminal charges." 2 days before our scheduled hearing, something even more dramatic happened. I was closing up the restaurant when my phone rang. It was Jake, and he sounded panicked. "Patrick, you need to get down to the courthouse. Mom's there with her attorney filing some kind of emergency petition. I heard her on the phone saying she's going to have you declared mentally incompetent tonight so you can't testify tomorrow." I called Beth immediately, and she met me at the courthouse within 30 minutes. What we discovered there was shocking, even by my mother's standards. She was attempting to file an emergency psychiatric hold petition claiming that I'd threatened suicide and was an immediate danger to myself. The petition was based on completely fabricated evidence, including alleged text messages I'd supposedly sent threatening to harm myself. She'd even lined up a psychiatrist who'd never met me but was willing to sign a statement recommending immediate, involuntary commitment. "This is perjury," Beth told the emergency duty judge when we arrived to contest the petition. "Ms. Morrison is filing false documents in an attempt to prevent her son from testifying in tomorrow's hearing about her financial fraud." The judge, the Honorable Patricia Williams, was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who clearly had little patience for family court theatrics. She listened to my mother's attorney present their fabricated evidence, then asked to see my phone to verify the alleged threatening text messages. Of course, no such messages existed. The number my mother claimed I'd sent them from wasn't even my current phone number. When Beth pointed out these discrepancies, Judge Williams' expression grew increasingly stern. "Ms. Morrison," the judge said, addressing my mother directly, "filing false documents with this court is a serious crime. Are you certain these text messages came from your son?" My mother's attorney tried to interrupt, but Judge Williams silenced her with a look. "I asked Ms. Morrison, not you, counselor. Ma'am, I'm giving you one chance to withdraw this petition before I refer this matter to the district attorney's office for prosecution." For a moment, I thought my mother might actually back down. But then her attorney whispered something in her ear, and her expression hardened. "Your Honor, my son is clearly being manipulated by dangerous individuals. These restaurant workers and homeless people have brainwashed him into believing false memories about his childhood. He's not competent to make decisions about his own welfare." Judge Williams leaned back in her chair and studied my mother for a long moment. "Ma'am, I've been presiding over family court for 23 years. I've seen every kind of family dysfunction imaginable. But I have rarely seen a parent work this hard to destroy their own child's credibility and independence." She turned to me. "Young man, do you feel threatened or unsafe?" "No, Your Honor. I feel manipulated and stolen from, but not threatened." "Do you have any intention of harming yourself or others?" "No, Your Honor. I want to continue building my life and pursuing my education." Judge Williams dismissed my mother's emergency petition and scheduled a hearing for the following week to consider sanctions against her and her attorney for filing false documents. But the real explosion came when we left the courthouse. Local media had gotten wind of the emergency hearing, and there were reporters waiting outside. One of them approached my mother with questions about the allegations of financial fraud and forged documents. My mother's response was captured on video and would later go viral on social media. Instead of declining to comment or maintaining her dignity, she launched into a tirade about how I was an ungrateful child who was destroying the family out of jealousy and spite. Patrick has always been jealous of his brother's success, she told the cameras. Jake is exceptional, and Patrick can't stand it. So he's making up these ridiculous stories about stolen money and favoritism. It's all lies designed to get attention and hurt Jake's college prospects. The reporter then asked about the trust fund documents Aunt Carol had provided. My mother's face went pale when she realized the media knew about the $50,000 theft. That money was used for family expenses, she said defensively. Patrick's grandmother wanted to help the whole family, not just him. A powerful act, but the will specifically designates the money as a trust fund for Patrick alone, the reporter pointed out. That's when my mother completely lost control. Patrick doesn't deserve that money. He's never worked for anything in his life. Jake is the one with potential. Jake is the one who deserves investment and support. The footage was devastating. Here was my mother on camera admitting that she believed Jake deserved financial support that had been legally designated for me. She was essentially confessing to the theft while trying to justify it. The story exploded on social media overnight. People who'd grown up in similar family dynamics shared their own stories of favoritism and financial abuse. Mental health professionals commented on the psychological damage caused by scapegoating one child while elevating another. Legal experts discussed the criminal implications of the trust fund theft. By morning, my mother's attorney had withdrawn from the case. Margaret Whitman issued a statement saying she couldn't continue representing a client who'd lied to her about the facts and filed false documents with the court. But I wasn't celebrating yet. The media attention was overwhelming, and I worried about how it would affect my quiet life in Cleveland. More importantly, I knew my mother wouldn't give up just because one strategy had failed. If anything, the public humiliation would make her more desperate and dangerous. 2 days later, I got confirmation of my fears. Tony called me at 6 a.m, his voice tight with anger. Patrick, you need to get down here right away. Someone vandalized the restaurant last night. When I arrived at Tony's kitchen, I found the front windows covered with spray-painted words, liar, and thief, and family destroyer. Someone had also slashed the tires on Tony's car and thrown rocks through his apartment windows. There was no proof my mother was responsible, but the timing was too coincidental to ignore. She was escalating from legal warfare to direct intimidation. That's when I realized this battle wasn't just about money anymore. It was about whether my mother would accept any limits on her control over my life, or whether she'd rather destroy everything than admit she'd been wrong. The war was far from over, but I wasn't fighting it alone anymore. I had legal representation, family support from Aunt Carol community backing from Tony and his customers, and most importantly, documentation of every crime my parents had committed. Whatever my mother tried next, I was ready for her. The vandalism at Tony's kitchen turned out to be my mother's final strategic mistake. The security camera from the check cashing store next door had captured clear footage of her throwing rocks at the restaurant windows at 2 a.m, her face clearly visible under the streetlight. When Beth presented this evidence to both the family court judge and the police, the entire dynamic of our case shifted. My mother was arrested and charged with vandalism and intimidation. More importantly, Judge Williams ruled that her pattern of escalating harassment and false legal filings demonstrated a complete disregard for the law and the welfare of her own son. The court case that I'd been dreading turned into a straightforward presentation of evidence. Beth laid out the financial documents showing years of theft from my accounts and trust fund. Aunt Carol testified about my grandmother's intentions for the money and the attempts to silence her when she questioned my parents' treatment of me. Even Jake, despite enormous pressure from our mother, testified truthfully about the favoritism he'd witnessed throughout our childhood. The most powerful moment came when Judge Williams asked my father, who'd been released from the hospital and was attending court against his cardiologist's advice, whether he wanted to contest the evidence of financial fraud. "No, Your Honor," he said quietly. "Everything Patrick and his attorney have presented is true. We stole from our son. We treated him unfairly. We tried to manipulate the legal system when he stood up for himself. I want to pay full restitution and ask the court to protect Patrick from any further harassment." My mother's new attorney, her third one since the case began, tried to argue for reduced damages and counseling instead of financial penalties. But Judge Williams was having none of it. "Ms. Morrison," the judge said, "you have stolen $50,000 from your son's trust fund, forged documents, filed false police reports, committed perjury, and engaged in criminal intimidation. Your son is 19 years old and has built a stable, independent life despite your efforts to undermine him. This court orders full restitution of all stolen funds plus 20% annual interest totaling $67,000. You will also pay Mr. Morrison's legal fees and court costs." The judge paused and looked directly at my mother. "Furthermore, I am issuing a restraining order prohibiting you from contacting Mr. Morrison directly or indirectly, visiting his workplace, or interfering with his education or employment. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and prosecution." But the legal victory, satisfying as it was, wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of understanding what family really means. 3 months after the court ruling, I used part of my restitution money to buy Tony's kitchen when he decided to retire and move to Florida to be closer to his grandchildren. I kept the name but expanded the menu and hired more staff, including several people from the homeless shelter who just needed someone to give them a chance. Frank, the Vietnam veteran who'd been my roommate during those first difficult nights, became my assistant manager. His military experience with logistics and organization made him perfect for managing food orders and staff schedules. Sarah, the young mother I'd met at the shelter, finished her GED and started working as my bookkeeper while taking online accounting classes. Carlos, my classmate from the community center, completed his electrician apprenticeship and did all the electrical work for the restaurant expansion. Jessica, the teenage mother who'd inspired me with her determination, graduated from nursing school and often stopped by for lunch, bringing her daughter, who was now walking and talking. The restaurant became more than just a business. It became a community center where people could get job training, GED tutoring, and sometimes just a safe place to belong. I started a program where formerly homeless individuals could work in exchange for meals and small apartment deposits. Local social workers began referring clients to us, and other restaurants in the area started similar programs. My relationship with Jake slowly began to heal. He'd graduated from high school and received baseball scholarship offers, but he surprised everyone by choosing to attend Cleveland State University so he could be closer to me and work part-time at the restaurant. He wanted to understand the business and learn what real work felt like instead of having everything handed to him. I spent 18 years being told I was special because I could hit a baseball, he told me one evening as we closed up the restaurant together. But watching you build all this, seeing how hard you work and how many people you're helping, I realized I don't know anything about being actually valuable to other people. My father visited once a month, always calling first and always respecting my boundaries. He was in therapy and on medication for his heart condition, and he seemed genuinely committed to understanding how his parenting had damaged our family. We were slowly building a relationship based on honesty rather than obligation, but it was careful work that couldn't be rushed. I never spoke to my mother again after the court case ended. According to Jake, she doubled down on her narrative that I was mentally ill and manipulated by criminals. She'd moved to another state and rarely contacted the rest of the family. Some people might say I should feel sorry for her, but I'd learned that you can't save someone who refuses to acknowledge they need saving. The restaurant's success led to other opportunities. I was invited to speak at community colleges about entrepreneurship and overcoming family dysfunction. A local food magazine wrote a feature story about our job training program. 3 other cities reached out asking for advice on starting similar community-based restaurant programs. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Rodriguez, my GED teacher who'd become a mentor and friend, nominated me for a community service award from the mayor's office. 6 months after buying the restaurant, I found myself standing in Cleveland City Hall, receiving a key to the city for my work with homeless individuals and at-risk youth. As I stood at the podium looking out at the audience, I saw faces that told the story of my new life. Tony and his wife had flown back from Florida for the ceremony. Frank sat in the front row wearing his old military dress uniform. Sarah was there with little Emma, who was now 2, and calling me Uncle Patrick. Carlos and Jessica sat with their families, both of them thriving in careers they'd built through education and hard work. Beth Armstrong was there, having become not just my attorney but a friend, who occasionally stopped by the restaurant to check on our legal compliance and enjoy our famous meatloaf. Even Aunt Carol had driven down from Ohio, proud to see the man her nephew had become, despite the odds stacked against him. 2 years ago, I thought family was something you were born into, I said during my acceptance speech. I thought it was about blood and obligation and loyalty you owed regardless of how you were treated. But I've learned that real family is something you build with people who see your value, celebrate your victories, and stand by you during struggles. I looked out at the audience again, seeing people who'd chosen to be part of my life because they believed in who I was, not what I could do for them. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is walking away from toxicity to find where you truly belong. Sometimes the family that matters most is the one that chooses you back. After the ceremony, we all went back to the restaurant for dinner. I cooked for 40 people, serving food I'd learned to prepare through trial and error and determination. The dining room was full of laughter and conversation, and the kind of warmth that comes from genuine affection rather than obligation. As the evening wound down and people started heading home, I stood behind the counter watching the last few tables finish their dessert. The restaurant was exactly what I'd envisioned, a place where people could find community opportunity and respect regardless of their background or circumstances. Jake was wiping down tables, learning the value of physical work and honest effort. Frank was counting the day's receipts, his military precision ensuring every penny was accounted for. Sarah was in the back office, YES updating our books, while Emma played with blocks in a corner. My phone, which I now kept on and answered regularly, buzzed with a text message. It was from my father. "Watched the ceremony online. So proud of the man you've become. Love you, son." I smiled and typed back, "Thanks, Dad. Love you too." It had taken 19 years of painful separation and a legal battle to get to that simple exchange. But it was worth every struggle to reach a place where love was freely given rather than conditionally offered. As I locked up the restaurant that night and climbed the stairs to my apartment, which I'd expanded into the space above the neighboring storefront, I thought about the scared 18-year-old who'd left home with nothing but a hoodie and $60. That kid had thought he was running away from his family. He'd had no idea he was actually running toward it. Now, looking ahead to culinary school applications, restaurant expansion plans, and a future filled with people who valued him for exactly who he was, I knew I'd made the right choice. The best families aren't the ones you're born into. They're the ones you build with people who choose to love and support you unconditionally. And if you're someone who's struggling in a family that doesn't see your worth, someone who's being told you're not good enough or not deserving of investment and love, I want you to know something important. You deserve better. You deserve to be valued. You deserve to have your achievements celebrated and your dreams supported. What was the hardest part of building your chosen family? Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relationships to find healthier ones? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel for more stories about overcoming family dysfunction, and share it with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone. Thank you for listening to my journey. Remember that your worth isn't determined by how your family treats you, It's determined by the love and respect you give and receive from people who truly see you. Keep building the life you deserve one day at a time. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.